Good morning, Shabbat Shalom, and welcome to United Israel World Union. This is our Sabbath morning scripture study coming to you live from beautiful St. Francisville, Louisiana. A little bit different than the last couple of weeks when I was with friends, Jono Vandor, who I see is logged in this morning. So, hello, Jono. I guess that maybe you're still working through that jet lag to be up at this time. And the Tylers. We had a wonderful trip, very fruitful, very beneficial, and the results of that will be evident over the next several months and year. But more on that later. Thank you very much for joining us today. It is good to be back. I'm excited to be back here in front of you and talking about the book of books. We're doing our morning scripture study. I'm going to do today sort of lay the groundwork, the foundations for one of our series within the series. You know that we're working presently on a longer series, a year-long series called The Pentateuch, A New Look. We're working through chronologically, actually working through week by week according to the annual cycle of readings, the 5 books of the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And we're in the book of Numbers now. We're in the 4th book of 5 in the Pentateuch. And so I wanted to do within the book, the 4th book, I want to do a series within our bigger series that you'll understand as we go forward. I'm going to be focusing on chronology and geography. Chronology and geography, a study of time and place, of all the events associated with the wilderness wanderings. So this happens to be one of my favorite fields of study. Those of you who have been here, who have sat with me in this place, know that I have an entire bookshelf associated with research dealing with the wilderness wanderings. I find that fascinating. It is such a key and central point of the story of the 5 books that we really need to spend some dedicated time working through that. So, without further ado, again, we are presently in the book of Numbers, as it is known in the English-speaking world in our ongoing study. This is class number 32. Class number 32. So we've been going at this a pretty good bit of time already. Now, one thing I'd like to say, because some of you are wondering, now, not wandering like the tribes of Israel, but wondering with an O, how are you going to make up for missing the first 2 annual parashot? How are you going to, you missed BaMidbar and you missed Naso because you were off in the wilderness playing with your friends. How are you going to make up for those 2? You'll be surprised. We're going to do that. Today we're going to go for about 4 hours, and I hope in that period of time to cover all of those. Some of you are already looking to log out. I'm joking. We're not going to go for 4 hours. But I do have a bit of catch up. And I want you to know that the book, the organization of the materials, lends itself to allow me the freedom to sort of crunch those first 2 sections and really focus on what I want to get to anyway. So it's going to be fun. The book that we're working in is known in the English non-Jewish world, let's say. Let's categorize. The English-speaking non-Jewish world is the book of Numbers. Numbers is the title of the book. Numbers comes to us from the Greek Arithmoi, and you can kind of figure that word out. Has to do with numbers, right? And that's an appropriate, seemingly fitting designation for a book that seems to be so preoccupied with numbers. We're going to deal with, particularly in the first chapter of the book of Numbers, with a census. The book right out of the gate begins with a census. And what you'll see is that chapters 1 through 4 basically deal with the number of the children of Israel. In fact, chapter 1 has a phrase that is repeated verbatim where it's dealing with, in the count, it is say in this tribe, those who are 20 and up, I'm going to read this, 20 and up, all who go out to war in Israel, their generations, their families, their fathers' houses, the numbers of their names, by their heads, all males, 20 and up, all going out to war, and then it gives a count. So that particular phrase, in the Hebrew obviously, is repeated. Here it is, and then it gives the number of those people. Then it goes to the next tribe, and it gives the number. Now, this goes all the way through until we get to a certain group. Go with me to the book of Numbers, BaMidbar, as it's called in Hebrew. We'll talk about that in a moment. Numbers chapter 1. Numbers chapter 1, and I want to just read, beginning in verse 47. This is after going through the count, the number of all the members by tribe, and then it says, verse 47, but the Levites, after their tribe of the fathers, were not numbered among them. For Jehovah had spoken to Moses, saying, only you shall not number the tribe of Levi, nor take the sum of them among the children of Israel, but you shall appoint the Levites over the tabernacle of testimony, and over all its vessels, and over all things that belong to it. They shall bear the tabernacle and all its vessels, and they shall minister to it, and shall encamp round about the tabernacle. And when the tabernacle sets forward, the Levites shall take it down. And when the tabernacle is to be pitched, the Levites shall set it up. And the stranger that comes near shall be put to death. And the children of Israel shall pitch their tents, every man by his own camp, every man by his own standard throughout their host. But the Levites shall pitch round about the tabernacle of testimony, that there be no wrath upon the congregation of the children of Israel. And the Levites shall keep the charge of the tabernacle of testimony. And the children of Israel did according to all that Jehovah commanded Moses, so they did. Now, this is not the last thing we're going to hear about the Levites. After chapter 1, this is followed by the arrangement of the tribes around the camp. So it gives very specific instructions on this tribe will be in this location, etc. Chapter 3, we get into, see how quickly I'm going through these first few chapters? Chapter 3 gives more detail on the sons of Aaron, the tribe of Levi in a broader sense. Beginning in verse 14, the Levites are counted in chapter 3, verse 14 and following. The Levites are counted, but they're separately counted from the other tribes. They're always going to be treated separately when we get to these kind of things. There are 3 groups of Levites. These are some high points because we'll need this information as we work through this series. And these 3 groups are going to be counted and their duties and responsibilities given. What are the 3 groups of Levites? Gershon, Kohath, and Merari, the 3 sons and their descendants of Levi. Now, in verse 40 of chapter 3, we get into yet another special counted group. There's a broad camp of all the tribes, the total number of those that are 20 years and up, etc., as I went through that list. When we get to chapter 3, verse 40 and following, the firstborn males are counted as a separate count within the count. This is a very thorough census. I want you to understand that. And then in chapter 4, we have yet one more counting that deals with a special group that falls within the range among the Levites between the range years 30 to 50. In other words, this is their ministerial career. It means I'm too old to be a minister now, I guess. But between the age of 30 to 50, that's when this group is active in their ministerial duties. Then the book of BaMidbar goes into some legal material. Now, this includes, but is not limited to, in chapter 5, we get this very bizarre ritual. It's often referred to as a trial of ordeal. And it's known as, in Hebrew, as the sotah. Now, sotah is based on a verb that means to go astray. So this idea in chapter 5 deals with a woman whose husband suspects, she's not guilty, suspects that she's committed adultery. And so you recall in the story that the woman is brought to the tabernacle, to the priest, and she is forced or coaxed or encouraged, or however you want to put it, to drink this bitter water. And I've often talked about that must be a very difficult ride home for the man. You know, if he brings his wife there, whatever the case may be, can you imagine going back home? That's not going to be a fun evening for anyone. Then in chapter 6, we get to what is called the Nazir, known popularly as the Nazarite. And that particular section in chapter 6 deals with this, what I've often referred to as a hyper-holiness, where a person, man or woman, can take upon themselves a vow of abstinence, if you will, of things associated with the grape. Vinegar, wine, raisins, grapes themselves, anything associated with that. They are also generally to let the hair of their body grow long and not cut it until the end of their vow. If it's for a specific period of time, then they can cut the hair. In fact, they're required to cut it after that time. But these are interesting topics. It's not what I'm talking about today. We work our way through one of the most beautiful and well-known passages in the Bible is what is often referred to as the priestly benediction. Chapter 6 of Numbers, beginning in verse 22, ending in verse 27. And I do want to read that just because I think it is quite beautiful. In fact, there was a discovery of a copy of this priestly blessing. Many of you have heard about this. And it is, to this day, if I'm not mistaken, the oldest testament to a passage in the Bible. This engraving that was discovered on this plate. And here's what it says. I'll give you the intro to it. Verse 22 of chapter 6 of Numbers. And Jehovah spoke to Moses, saying, Speak to Aaron and to his sons, saying, In this way you shall bless the children of Israel, saying to them, Jehovah bless thee and keep thee. Jehovah make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. Jehovah lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. And they shall put my name upon the children of Israel, and I will bless them. Quite lovely. The priestly benediction or the priestly blessing. Now, this is then followed by the gifts of the chieftains. Those heads of the houses of the tribes all bring a gift towards the communal efforts of Israel. And you'll notice that all of the gifts are exactly the same. Much can be gleaned from that. In fact, I've taught on this before, and others have taught this idea of everyone contributing. No one contributes more, no one contributes less, and it all works toward the beautification of God's work. There are plenty of good lessons in that. This now, in a quick overview and summary, brings us to the Torah portion for today. This particular portion is the third in 10 readings, according to the annual cycle of reading, of the book of BaMidbar. What I want you to understand at the outset is that Numbers contains far more than just numbers. The first 4 chapters are primarily concerned with numbers and counting, but beyond there, there's quite a bit of beautiful material throughout the book, and we're going to get into some of that. So what I want to do this morning is to back things up, to back up and take a much more general approach to the book and talk a little bit more about what it primarily is about. It does contain a census, a very detailed and accurate census, But when you look at the book as a whole, you get this idea that it's not really about numbers at all. So I want to go beyond the book of Numbers called BaMidbar, and I want to focus on not only BaMidbar as a book, but the Pentateuch as a whole, because remember at the outset I told you I'm going to begin a series within the series, and I'm going to be looking primarily at geography and chronology, time and place, particularly focusing on the wilderness wanderings. Now, things in this series, I believe, are about to begin to get more interesting and insightful. Everyone knows, from a casual reading even of the Pentateuch, that the children of Israel spent 40 years in the wilderness, give or take. 40 years in the wilderness. So this means that we must focus our attention towards this space, place, and time. Where and when do these stories that we're so familiar with, or we think we are, when do they take place? Where do they take place? And can we put them on a map? That's the geography. And do we have different ideas, different names, different designations for these places? And then can we put them in a point in time? Is it easy to identify when a certain story is written? Do we have variations on the same story mentioned in different books? Remember, this process that we've been learning over the past couple of years now is what I've called horizontal reading. Do we have instances in the wilderness wanderings where one particular story is told in one book of the Pentateuch and it's told differently in another book of the Pentateuch? The answer to that is yes. Now, I wanted to offer this up front. Don't get nervous about this. This is quite insightful, as you will see as we work through. I want to know when and where the stories take place according to our authors. What are they trying to communicate to us in the books of Exodus, primarily Exodus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy? And then I want to know, can we discern with any degree of certainty when they were written? Were they written in the time of Moses, or were they written after the time of Moses? Good question. Okay. So we're working on, put an underline in your notes if you haven't gotten this yet, geography and chronology of the greatest generation. Now, why do I call it the greatest generation? We're in the wilderness, and I've used this analogy before. Years ago in a former life, not that kind of former life, I mean in a previous spiritual setting, I used to hear people say, "Brother, I'm in a desert, I'm in a dry place, I'm in a wilderness in my spiritual walk." You ever feel like that? And my response is always the same. You're in a wilderness place? You mean you hear from God? You're miraculously fed and cared for? Your shoes never wear out? Is that what you mean? It's obviously not what they mean. Because the image most people have of the wilderness is just dry. There's a lack of food. There's a lack of water. There's a reason to complain. And I think a lot of people, spiritually speaking, find themselves in a wilderness that only represents part of that experience. What I want to do is begin to show, yes, we'll talk about the grumbling and complaining and the lack. We'll talk about the awesome nature of the wilderness, the fearfulness of being in that dreaded place, but we're also going to draw out the other side of that, the miraculous, the idea that God is in control and God is guiding His people as we work through. So I want to introduce you to that wilderness generation. The fourth book of the Pentateuch is known by Hebrew readers as BaMidbar. BaMidbar. BaMidbar typically is translated in the wilderness. Go with me to BaMidbar, Numbers chapter 1. Numbers chapter 1. In Numbers chapter 1, beginning in verse 1, it says, "And Jehovah spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai." Now, first of all, I want to point out, this is not just any wilderness. This is not just in the wilderness, meaning any old wilderness will do. BaMidbar begins in the wilderness of Sinai. And the Lord Jehovah spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai in the tent of meeting on the first day of the second month in the second year after they were come out of the land of Egypt. Now, again, the Bible talks about many wildernesses, and we're going to cover some of those wildernesses in our study of the journeys of the children of Israel. This particular wilderness that we begin with is the wilderness of Sinai. Now, it's also known as Horeb. There are other wildernesses, but I want you to remember we begin here today in the wilderness of Sinai, and this is very important to begin our study of chronology and geography going forward in our series within a series at Sinai, at Horeb. And the reason is because so much of the story can be traced back to this place, right? Think of everything that takes place in the wilderness of Sinai. We're going to cover the Sinai period today, and then we're going to take our journey, just like the children of Israel. So it traces back to this place. Now, I want to go back in time with you just a moment to show you the significance of this central place, Sinai Horeb. Go with me to the book of Exodus, Exodus chapter 3. Exodus chapter 3 and verse 1. Now, this is Moses has fled Egypt. He has gone somewhere out of what was then Egypt. Notice how I'm phrasing this. To another place, to a place among the people of Midian. He is there met by this point a man by the name of Jethro, Reuel, Hovav. I know people argue, and I know that I can see without looking the comments, Hovav is actually this person, and this is, and they try to reconcile this, but this person's name is referred to as three different names, Hovav, Reuel, and Jethro. So Moses meets Jethro. He is introduced to one of this chieftain priest daughters by the name of Zipporah. He marries Zipporah, and he's keeping his father-in-law's sheep. Here we go, chapter 3, verse 1. Now Moses kept the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock into the desert and came to the mountain of God, Har Ha-Elohim. I want you to recognize and know this phrase. He comes to a place called Har Ha-Elohim, the mountain of God, comma, to Horeb. So here he is. Now, interestingly enough, we get a little bit of geography here. We know that from where he's at, he walks with the flock. He can walk an extended period distance, but he goes to what's called sometimes the far place in the wilderness. In Hebrew, it's Achar, which is sometimes associated with the west. So he's in the western side of BaMidbar, in the wilderness, west in the wilderness, and he there comes to a place called Har Ha-Elohim. Now, one of the things I want to point out here is that this place is called the mountain of God before the 10 words are given, before the revelation of Sinai, meaning that this place is considered sacred by ancient desert peoples before the Hebrews come there. You get that? I'm going to show you that this place is known. We get hints at it from the text. It's not some secret mountain in Narnia. This place is well known to the desert peoples of the time. By the way, in the story, it goes on to say, verse 2, and the angel of Jehovah, the messenger of Jehovah, appeared to him in a flame of fire out of the midst of a bush. And he looked, and behold, the bush burned with fire, but the bush was not consumed. Moses then turns to see. So we know that the Malach Yehovah is in this area, which is going to be significant. It's going to be a clue, if you will. Later in the text, we'll find this messenger in another place in the wilderness. Might help us geographically. But it says that there's this bush. Now, in Hebrew, this is an interesting word for bush. It's hasneh. It's got the same root letters, the samach and the nun, as the term Sinai. Now, one proposal, many people have proposed this proposal, is that somehow this place gets its name from Sneh. Sinai, Sneh, because this bush is prevalent in this region, this certain kind of bush, but be that as it may. We know that Moses is told, look down at verse 12. By the way, Moses is told he's going to deliver the children of Israel from the land of Egypt. He's never encountered God before, as far as we know. But look down at verse 12. And this is God speaking to Moses. And he said, certainly I will be with you, and this shall be a sign to you that I have sent you. When you've brought the people out of Egypt, you shall serve God upon this mountain. So Moses is told, you're going to go get the children of Israel, and wherever he's at now, he's at Har Ha-Elohim. He is on the western side of the wilderness, according to my understanding, and he's at this place known to be sacred before the children of Israel get there, and God tells him, you're going to go get them, you're going to bring them back to this place where you will serve me. Now, question is, where is this place? This is where it begins. It begins in Egypt. They have to bring them from Egypt, but the story actually begins at Sinai. He's to go get them, bring them back here. In his interactions with Pharaoh, there are 3 passages. Write these down. Exodus 3:18, Exodus chapter 5 and verse 3, and Exodus 8 verse 27. And the reason it's important to know these verses is because it could provide us a clue. Because it says 3 times, Moses in his interactions with Pharaoh, he makes this comment, we need to go a 3 days journey into the wilderness. Now, is it going to take 3 days? Doesn't necessarily. A 3-day journey can take a lot longer than that, depending on what happens along the way. You can set out for a 3-hour trip, and it end up being extended because you get shipwrecked. Some of you from the 60s and 70s catch that little. But the idea is that it's a 3-day journey is what they request. And then over and over, Moses uses the same phrase from God to Pharaoh, shalaketami, send forth my people. Send forth my people, shalaketami, shalaketami, so that they might serve me. But they're not just going to serve me any old place. According to the text, they're going to serve God on this mountain known as Har Ha-Elohim. It's in a place called Horeb. It's associated with the phrase Sinai as well. Now, it seems to me that this location, if you travel it along normal travel routes, You could arrive there in short order. It's going to be easy to identify. It's going to be within a 3 days journey, and people know it. So like if you find someone along the route, you say, excuse me, how do you get to Horeb? And they'll say, oh, you just keep going. You're on the path. Just follow the track, and you'll notice along the way that, you'll get there. The reason that I'm convinced that it is, it's along the trail, and it's not just, like they didn't leave Egypt and just wander off through wadis. And someone told me when we were in Israel, I was having a conversation with an observant person, and their view, according to tradition, is that God raised the land of the low places up so it was just smooth walking, like it was a paved road the whole way. And I'll be honest, I find that to be a stretch. I'm okay with people believing that if they'd like to believe it, but A, it's not in the text, and B, it's not realistic. This terrain is rugged. It's rough. You don't just start off in Egypt and draw a line to, your intended destination. You can't do it. Now, some of you are in great shape, and you might be able to walk through wadis and up and down and over mountains and etc. just to go straight, because a straight line is a shorter distance. But I promise you, most of you, and I don't even know you, many of you, but most of you probably couldn't. You would take a desirable route. And so what we have to do is be sensible when we think about how do you go from point A to point B. It's going to likely be a circuitous route. It's going to likely involve following the natural terrain. And some people might think, well, it looks a lot different now than it did 3,500 years ago. Well, I've read geological studies that challenge that. Most of the scientists that I've read on this subject, and I actually have read materials on this, and they say it looks about the same as it always has. Now, were there places which were more supple or with vegetation? And perhaps, but generally the lay of the land doesn't lend itself to just mark out a straight line and walk. I think it's about 3 days journey to get there along the route if things go well and you don't have 603,550 males plus women, children, carts, etc. Now, go with me to Exodus chapter 4. Exodus chapter 4, and I want to read verse 14. Now, this is a continuation where Moses is challenging God that he's not the right person for this task. And notice verse 14, and the anger of Jehovah burned against Moses, and he said, remember Moses has said, look, I'm not the guy, I can't speak well. And he said, is not Aaron the Levite your brother? I know he can speak well, and also, behold, he comes to meet you. And when he sees you, he'll be glad in his heart. And you're going to speak to him, put the words in his mouth, and I will be with your mouth and with his mouth, and will teach you what you shall do. Let me ask you something. Where is Aaron? He's in Egypt. God tells Moses, look, he's coming to meet you, and he's going to be glad when he finds you. Now, I'm not discounting a miraculous guidance here, but if God tells Aaron to go meet Moses, how's he going to get there? How long is it going to take? I have questions. I think the text answers that. You know why? Because the text answers that. God does tell Moses. Now look with me down at verse 27 of chapter 4. Remember, Aaron is where? Egypt. Verse 27 of chapter 4. Jehovah said to Aaron, go to the wilderness. Lech likrat Moshe Hamid Bara. Go to meet Moses towards the wilderness. Is that a real good direction there? So Aaron is going to go meet Moses towards the wilderness. He's in Egypt. Now, does he need to walk to Saudi Arabia? That's my first question. Some of you are saying, yes, he does. No, he doesn't. But anyway, and the Lord said to Aaron, go to the wilderness to meet Moses. And he went, and he met him in the mountain of God. So guess where he meets? At Har Ha-Elohim. Now, that's where Moses was. And it says he kissed him. And Moses told Aaron all the words of Jehovah who had sent him and all the signs which he had commanded him. Moses and Aaron went and gathered together all the elders of the children of Israel. And Aaron spoke all the words which Jehovah had spoken to Moses and did all the signs in the sight of the people. Listen to this. Now, I believe that you can have a period of time between verses. God tells Aaron, go meet Moses towards the wilderness. He goes. How far does he go? I think he's got about a 3 days journey. He arrives at Har Ha-Elohim, which is the known place along the route. He finds Moses. How are you going to find somebody in the middle of the wilderness, without further direction than that? But he meets Moses, he hugs him, kisses him. And then the next verse says, and they go gather the elders of Israel. Did they walk back from Saudi Arabia? And no, they didn't. So, the interesting thing is that we're placing Horeb and Sinai at an interesting point. Now, I want to focus on this Horeb-Sinai place because it's very important to our story. And so I want you to look with me. Once they go get the children of Israel, I'm going to fast forward through the story, all the signs and wonders that God does to Pharaoh and all of Egypt, something that's spoken of in not only the Pentateuch, but in my Moses scroll. He does these signs and wonders to Pharaoh and to all of Egypt, whatever they are, and then they leave. Now look at chapter 17 of Exodus, because by chapter 17, they're already in this region. Now look, we're going to start at verse 1. I just want to read verses 1 through 7. All the congregation of the children of Israel journeyed from the wilderness of Sin by their stages, according to the commandment of Jehovah. Now in Hebrew, this is al pi Yehovah, according to the mouth of Jehovah. So God is directing their travels. And they pitched in Rephidim. Look at any Bible map. Guess what Rephidim has right next to it? A question mark. It's the first place they go, right? So if you don't know where that is, some people put it right across, some people put it down south, some people put it by the Gulf of Gulf of Suez. I mean, it's all over the map, literally. But they pitch at Rephidim, and there was no water for the people to drink. Wherefore the people did strive with Moses and said, give us water that we may drink. And Moses said to them, why do you strive with me? Why do you tempt Jehovah? And the people thirsted there for water, and the people murmured against Moses and said, why have you brought us up out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our cattle with thirst? And Moses cried to Jehovah, saying, what shall I do to this people? They're almost ready to stone me. And Jehovah said to Moses, pass before the people, take with you of the elders of Israel and your rod with you, with which you smote the river, take in your hand and go. Behold, I'll stand before you there upon the rock at Horeb. At Horeb? Now wait a minute. We're at Rephidim. So could Rephidim be in this region? Because now, just a few verses later, same context, there's been no break. God says, I'm going to stand before you at Horeb. And you shall smite the rock, and there shall come water out of it, and your people can drink. And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel, and he called the name of the place Massah and Meribah, because of the strife of the children of Israel, because they tempted Jehovah, saying, is Jehovah among us or not? And then another clue comes in, because Amalek then comes. Where is Amalek? It's another study. It's another day. But the point is, by chapter 17, they've just shortly crossed the water. Now, the idea, and I've taught this in other classes, I'm not going to go into this other than to mention, the waterway that they cross is called Yam Suf. Yam Suf, translated Red Sea. In some translations, it literally means the Sea of Reeds. There are 3 bodies of water that are called the Sea of Reeds in the Tanakh. They are this body of reedy marshland east of Goshen. They are the Gulf of Suez, is referred to as Yam Suf, and the Gulf of Aqaba. So people who support or believe in one of the other Horebs, the other Sinais, can say, they'll only give you part of this, and they'll say, look, the Gulf of Aqaba is called Yam Suf, so therefore they crossed the Gulf of Aqaba, hundreds of meters of water standing in a wall on either side, and they crossed over. And some will say, I'm not going to go off on this too long, but there's this land bridge at Nuweiba, and go do the geological see. Look how deep that is. Imagine how tall that water has to be. But people like their miracles big, so they want it to be that. But anyway, so there are 3 bodies of water that they cross, but I want you to understand that Rephidim is very close, evidently, after they cross over, and it's also associated with the location Horeb. Now, look at chapter 18. Chapter 18 of Exodus, verse 5. Now this is, it says, and Jethro, Moses' father-in-law, came with his sons and his wife to Moses, BaMidbar, in the wilderness where he camped at the Mount of God. And he said to Moses, I, your father-in-law Jethro, am come to you, and your wife and your 2 sons, her 2 sons with her. So Jethro, knows where this mountain is, and he goes to meet Moses at the mountain. It's like all of these desert people know exactly where it is. Like you go, hey, meet me at the White House. It's a known location. Or, meet me at Wrigley Stadium or whatever. It's a known place among these desert people. And you're like, where will I meet you, Moses? It's going to be so hard to find you in the wilderness. Yeah, you can find me at Har Ha-Elohim. I'll be there. He knows where it's at. Now, we also know from the story that Zipporah and the boys went with Moses once. They went this route. They were there in chapter 6. They went to Egypt, and then Moses sends them back. Can you imagine sending your wife and kids? You just go, honey, I'm busy. I can't go. Take the kids, and you guys just head out across the wilderness, and, maybe you'll make it to Midian. It's a long journey. Bring lots of water. No, it's not. The story is telling us this is not like you imagine, not like people are trying to tell you. The text gives us the clues. All right. Now, go with me to Exodus 19 and verse 1. Exodus 19 and verse 1. In the 3rd month, after the children of Israel were gone out of the land of Egypt, the same day they came into the wilderness of Sinai. For they departed from Rephidim and were come to the desert of Sinai and had pitched BaMidbar in the wilderness, and there Israel camped before the mountain. Notice how we've got some things to consider here. We already know from chapter 17 that they're at Rephidim, and Rephidim is in proximity to Horeb. Horeb is also known as Sinai. When Moses is told by God, stand on the rock at Horeb, he doesn't mean in several weeks when you get there. He means go do it. He goes from Rephidim, he stands there. This event takes place, Exodus 17. Now, the interesting thing is that in chapter 18, they're already camped at the mountain. Chapter 19 is sort of a backflash or a flashback. I got that backwards. It's a flashback. He says, look, in the 3rd month after the children of Israel were gone out of the land of Egypt, that's when they came to the Sinai desert. Rephidim's right there. They just left Rephidim, but they're in this region, in BaMidbar. Now, look at chapter 19, Exodus, verse 16. It came to pass on the third day in the morning, there were thunders, lightnings, thick cloud upon the mountain, the sound of a shofar exceeding loud, so that all the people in the camp trembled. And Moses brought the people out of the camp to meet with God. And they stood at the foot of the mountain. Mount Sinai smoked in every part, because the Lord descended upon it in fire. The smoke of it ascended like the smoke of a furnace, and the whole mountain quaked greatly. And the voice of the shofar sounded louder and louder. Moses speaks, God answers him by a voice. Jehovah came down upon Mount Sinai on the top of the mountain, and Jehovah called Moses up to the top of the mountain. Moses went up. Now, this is a fear-inspiring event. We've covered this. Is the fear caused by the voice of God? Remember, they say, you talk to us, we don't want to hear God's voice again lest we die. Is there any indication that the volume of God's voice is what scared them? We have thunder, lightning, ominous weather patterns. We have a sound of a shofar that's getting louder and louder and louder. But I put something forward for your consideration. How do we know how loud the voice was? All it says here is that God spoke in a voice. Could the voice have been heard? It can be, I'm just saying, is it booming, or did each person hear the voice? Now hold that thought. We'll come back to it. From this point, when they arrive at Horeb, Sinai, until Numbers chapter 10, which is in our Torah reading today, the children of Israel are camped at that one place. They never leave. They remain at Horeb, Sinai until this. Go with me to the book of Numbers. You didn't think I'd ever get to the Torah portion today. Numbers chapter 10. Numbers chapter 10, verse 11. And it came to pass on the 20th day of the second month, in the second year, that the cloud was taken up off the tabernacle of the testimony, and the children of Israel took their journeys out of the wilderness of Sinai. And the cloud rested in the wilderness of Paran. And they first took their journey according to the commandment of Jehovah by the hand of Moses. Now, we find here, Numbers chapter 10, 11 through 13, that they are only now moving. They've not moved from the time that they were in the region first, all the way back in Exodus 17. That means that from the first year of their Exodus, the third month, to the second year, second month, the children of Israel are in the region of Sinai and Horeb. That means they're there for roughly a year. I mean, you can figure that out. Now, interestingly enough, I want you to look with me. This is Numbers chapter 10. Notice that in Numbers 10, 11 through 13, the way the people know to move is that God, it says that the cloud moves and they move. The cloud stays still, they stop. Cloud moves, they move. But I want you to understand, cloud is not moved until the second year, second month. Everybody follow me so far? Now let's go back. Numbers chapter 9, verse 15. Numbers chapter 9, verse 15. This is, by the way, get this, before the tabernacle and Israel ever moves, it says this. And on the day that the tabernacle was erected, we have a date for that, by the way, the cloud covered the tabernacle, namely the tent of the testimony. And at evening there was upon the tabernacle, as it were, the appearance of fire until the morning. So it was always, the cloud covered it by day, and the appearance of fire by night. And when the cloud was taken up from the tabernacle, then after that the children of Israel journeyed. And in the place where the cloud abode, there the children of Israel camped. At the command of Jehovah the children of Israel journeyed. At the command of Jehovah they encamped. As long as the cloud abode upon the tabernacle, they remained in camp. And when the cloud tarried long upon the tabernacle, many days, then the children of Israel kept the charge of Jehovah and journeyed not. And at times it was that the cloud was a few days on the tabernacle, according to the commandment of Jehovah, they remained in camp. And according to the commandment of Jehovah, they journeyed. At times it was that the cloud abode from evening until morning, and that the cloud was taken up in the morning, then they journeyed. Whether it was a day or by night, the cloud was taken up, they journeyed. Whether it was 2 days or a month or a year, that the cloud tarried upon the tabernacle, remaining over it, the children of Israel remained in camp and journeyed not. But when it was taken up, they journeyed. At the command of Jehovah, they remained in camp. At the command of Jehovah, they journeyed. They kept the charge of Jehovah at the commandment of Jehovah by the hand of Moses. The reason I read that is so I can show you something. He says, Numbers chapter 9 tells us, listen, the movement of Israel throughout the wilderness journey is indicated by the move of the cloud. When the cloud moves, sometimes it's only a day. Whether it's a day or a week or a month or a year, when the cloud's there, they stay there. When the cloud moves, they move. I bring that up because chapter 9 tells us this before they've ever moved. Chapter 9 is an author telling us, I'm not suggesting it's not true, I'm not suggesting it's not accurate. I'm telling you that this is written at a time when someone is looking back saying, here's the way the journeys happened. It's what we call an anachronism. It's not something that fits the normal flow, because remember, they've not moved yet. And it's telling us, here's the way these movements happen. It's written later, okay? Now, this section begins, which says, when the tabernacle was set up. Look with me at Exodus chapter 40. I told you we're going to be doing what's called horizontal reading and utilizing all of our sources to put this together. This will make sense as we work through. Chapter 40 of Exodus, verse 1. Jehovah spoke to Moses, saying, on the first day of the first month you shall set up the tabernacle of the tent of meeting. So we know year 1, first day, first month, tabernacle is set up. Look down at verse 17, chapter 40, verse 17. It came to pass in the first month in the second year, second year, on the first day of the month, the tabernacle was erected. All right? Now look down at verse 33 of chapter 40. So first month, second year. Chapter 33, and he erected the court round about the tabernacle and the altar, and set up the screen of the court gate. So Moses finished the work. The cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of Jehovah filled the tabernacle, and Moses was not able to enter the tent of meeting because the cloud rested on it, and the glory of Jehovah filled the tabernacle. And when the cloud was taken up from over the tabernacle, the children of Israel went onward in all their journeys. But if the cloud were not taken up, then they journeyed not till the day it was taken up. For the cloud of Jehovah was upon the tabernacle by day, fire was on it by night, in the sight of all the house of Israel throughout all their journeys. But they haven't journeyed yet. So chapter 40 gives us the historical account, according to the author, of the erection of the tabernacle on this particular date. And then he says, whenever the tabernacle moved, which won't be for a year and 19 days, the cloud lifts and they move. Isaiah. See, I want to get to Isaiah. I've got that coming. Exodus 40 is doing just like Numbers chapter 9, it's saying, while I'm telling you this, I want to give you more information about the movement through the wilderness. Every time the cloud lifts, children of Israel move. Okay. So the tabernacle is set up, second year, first month, first day. The first move is the second year, second month, and 20th day. So we have 1 month and 19 days where the tabernacle is set up at Sinai, Horeb. Then the cloud moves, and its first stop is a place called Paran. Paran. What do we know about Paran? Roughly, the children of Israel are at Sinai, Horeb, about a year. They're in God's place. I want you to understand, because we're going to get into some prophecies later where we talk about this, where God actually says, I will return to my place. What does that mean? God says he's going to his place? Think about that. Where is it? Well, he tells us. His place is in this region, Har Ha-Elohim. Now look with me. I'm going to go through a couple of passages. Go to Deuteronomy chapter 33. Chapter 33 of Deuteronomy. I'm going to read verses 1 and 2. This is the blessing with which Moses, the man of God, blessed the children of Israel before his death. He said, Jehovah came from Sinai and rose up from Seir to them. He shone forth from Mount Paran. He came from holy multitudes. From his right hand went a fiery law for them. Beautiful poetic passage here. But I want you to notice 3 places associated. This is like God is coming from, and it gives a direction, like the geography of the redemption. Comes from Sinai, rose up from Seir. Where is Seir? So we know this region, this desert region, from Seir to Sinai. It gives a directional path. And then it mentions Paran. Now, go with me to the book of Habakkuk. The book of Habakkuk. And I want to read a passage in Habakkuk chapter 3. Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk. I know you don't need that help, but I always do it in my head. Habakkuk chapter 3. God comes from Teman, verse 3, and the Holy One from Mount Paran. Selah. His glory covered the heavens, and the earth was full of his praise. There is a brightness as the light. Rays issue from his hand. There the hiding of his power is lodged. It goes on to talk about the tents of Cushan, the curtains in the land of Midian. Where's the land of Midian? People often put it on a map and say, here is the land of Midian, but that is very conjectural, and I challenge that highly based on my studies, so we'll get into more of that. The idea that I want you to get is Sinai, Horeb, Paran, all of these places are associated with this desert manifestation of God. Now, interestingly enough, in Genesis 21, I'm not going to go there, I just want you to have it in your notes. In Genesis 21, when Abraham sends out Hagar and Ishmael, they go to the wilderness around Beersheba, right? I want you to think about the wilderness of Beersheba. They find themselves in the wilderness there, and they meet the messenger of Jehovah. I like to think that this Malach Yehovah hangs out in the wilderness based on our text. So if you look at Genesis 21 later, look at verse 14 and verse 20 and 21, because it describes not only the wilderness near Beersheba, but it also mentions this, that the lad grew and he dwelt in Paran, which I say is not very far from this area, and his mom gets a wife from Egypt. So, you know, this is kind of giving me some hints maybe about where we're at geographically. We're going to get to this in the next couple of weeks, but in chapter 13 of the book of Numbers, Paran is the place from which the tribes are sent into the land to spy out the land. So if they're in Paran, not far from Horeb, and they send the spies to go into the land to spy it out, and we know the route they took, are they coming from Saudi Arabia? All right, so we need to get this. Now, a couple more passages. Let's do one more. Go with me to the book of Judges. Judges, Shoftim, chapter 5. Shoftim, chapter 5, verse 4. Jehovah, when you went out of Seir, when you did march out of the field of Edom, the earth trembled and the heavens dropped. The clouds also dropped water. The mountains melted from before Jehovah. That's Sinai before Jehovah, God of Israel. Goes on to give a few more clues, but this idea, this holy region. Now we get, it's called Sinai, it's called Horeb. Sinai only occurs once in Deuteronomy chapter 33:2, which we just read. Sinai only occurs once in Deuteronomy. Deuteronomy prefers to refer to this place as Horeb. Uses it 9 times. Deuteronomy uses Horeb 9 times. Now, Horeb occurs elsewhere in the Pentateuch only in Exodus chapter 3, verse 1, Exodus chapter 17, verse 6, and Exodus 33, 6. Everywhere else, this holy place is called by the writer of Exodus Sinai. It occurs 34 times in Scripture, Sinai does, only once in Deuteronomy. And that passage, by the way, is third person, seems to be written by someone other than Moses. Go with me to 1 Kings 19. I'm winding things down. 1 Kings chapter 19. Now, people love this. They take it and they look for a way to identify where Sinai, Horeb is. Look at chapter 19 of 1 Kings, and we're going to go to verse 8. And he arose, this is Elijah, and did eat and drink, and went in the strength of that meal 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God. So people will often say he ate a meal, and it took him 40 days and nights to reach Horeb, so then they can draw a circle around from the starting point and say, it's this far away. I'm going to leave that alone for right now. Go to verse 11 of 1 Kings 19. And he said, go out and stand upon the mountain before Jehovah. And behold, Jehovah passed by. A great and strong wind rent the mountains, broke the rocks in pieces before Jehovah. Now this would be scary, I want you to know. It's like an earthquake. But Jehovah was not in the wind, and after the wind an earthquake, but Jehovah was not in the earthquake. All of this stuff is awesome and awe-inspiring and scary and fearful. And after the earthquake, a fire. But Jehovah was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still small voice. Now I think the one of Sinai, the one at Horeb, creates this, from what we know, from both the story in Exodus 19 and 20 and the story in Deuteronomy 5, we get the story of this awe-inspiring show with lightning and shaking and earthquake and wind, and it's awe-inspiring. And then we get a voice. What says the voice is loud? What if the voice that's heard in 1 Kings 19, much of the same show is going on, the awe-inspiring events take place, but the voice itself, in Hebrew it's damamadaka, a thin whisper. You can hear it. Nothing says you can't hear a whispered tone. Earthquake, fire. Don't be thrown off by this thin whisper. The scene at Sinai and Horeb on the day of assembly doesn't say that the voice is booming. The people feared, yes, and it was associated with God speaking, but nowhere does it mention the volume of the voice. The wilderness region, Sinai, Horeb, Paran, is God's place, wherein is the mountain of Elohim, Har Ha-Elohim, where he spoke. It's interesting, by the way, that Midbar, which is translated wilderness, the seeming root of that is Devar, which is tied to speak. It's almost like Midbar is the place where you hear God speaking. The prophet Isaiah said that it's in the wilderness that the voice can be heard. Go with me to Isaiah chapter 40. Isaiah chapter 40 and verse 3. It says, Kol koreh BaMidbar, a voice cries in the wilderness. The translation there, Kol koreh, can be translated a voice cries or a voice is crying. Panu derek Yehovah, prepare the way of Yehovah. But listen, the verb is in the state of continued activity. Isaiah is saying that if you go BaMidbar, if you go in the wilderness, that voice is calling. You can hear it now. It doesn't say a voice cried. It doesn't say a voice will cry. It says, Kol koreh BaMidbar. Panu derek Adonai. Prepare the way. At this point in the narrative, Israel has only been out of Egypt for about a year. Most of that was spent at Horeb, at Sinai. In chapter 10, verse 11, they leave the mountain of God. Now, Moses recalls this same event. Numbers chapter 10, verse 11. The cloud lifts and they move. Go with me to Deuteronomy. I want to begin just to lay one thing in place for next week. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 1. Moses here is going to give us a first-person account connected to the departure from Horeb. Yeah, I think it's interesting that Deuteronomy begins when the children of Israel leave Sinai. Very interesting. Also, the Moses scroll begins with this. Listen to this. Verse 6 of chapter 1. Jehovah our God spoke to us in Horeb, saying, You've dwelt long enough in this mountain. Turn, take your journey, go to the mountain of the Amorites and to the places near it, in the plain, in the hills, in the lowland, in the Negev, and by the seaside, to the land of the Canaanites and the Lebanon, as far as the great river, the river Parat. Behold, I've set the land before you. Go in and possess the land which Jehovah swore to your fathers, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give them and to their seed after them. Moses begins Deuteronomy, his first-person account. This is very similar to what we find in the Moses scroll, with the command, you've been at this mountain long enough, it's time to leave. So what I want you to see is that Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers chapter 1 through 9, all lead us to the point in chapter 10 where Deuteronomy picks up. So what that tells you is that my journey as we work and walk and follow the children of Israel is going to look at Deuteronomy and the book of Numbers from chapter 10 and show the similarities here, or the differences as the case might be. We're going to begin to look at these together because Deuteronomy shares overlapping sources from here on out with the book of BaMidbar. So from Numbers chapter 10, if you're creating a table like I've encouraged you to do with horizontal reading, Numbers chapter 10 verse 11 and following somehow is going to match up with Deuteronomy chapter 1 and following. And you're going to see sort of a synoptic approach to the wilderness itineraries. I have here, by the way, I'm not saying you should get this. In fact, you shouldn't. I'm telling you. I spent the money on it because it says Map of the Exodus and Wilderness Journey. I said, oh boy, this is going to be good. And I open it up so excitedly because Bezos sent this to me. You know Bezos, a friend of mine. I ought to be his friend. I think I paid for one of his rocket rides. It says the 42 campsites organized and illustrated, get this, for the first time in history. You got my $15, but it's wrong. It doesn't match the text of the Bible. It is a cool map, but it just doesn't match the storyline. You got to give it to somebody for trying, though. So what we want to do, though, is we want to look at our sources, and this is based on an attempt from the story within the Pentateuch to follow the children of Israel as they journey. But it's only by reading the text horizontally that we'll be able to understand the details necessary to interpret and find these places. If you take one text that calls the Gulf of Aqaba Yam Suf, and you want your miracle to be big, you can use the Bible to paint that picture. But you have to look at every reference to Yam Suf. You have to say what makes the most sense here. If I'm trying to get 603,550 men, and plus their women and children, and some of them, just like some of you, can't walk very far at a time without taking a break. So, and that's not an insult. That's just being honest. You know, you would have the infirmed, you would have elder. And listen, the Bible says nowhere in this Torah narrative that God took all the wadis and made them smooth as glass so that they could walk on them quickly. It doesn't say they walked 24 hours a day. Some people say they went day and night without stopping. We don't have to make excuses for the Bible. We just have to read it. And when we read the text and begin to pull these texts together, we'll find something remarkable. And that's what we want to do. By the way, just to show you a little bit more of the mesh, Deuteronomy 1, 6 through 8 says, it indicates that God said, you've been at the mountain too long enough, pack it up and move. Numbers chapter 10, verse 11 says, the cloud moved and the children of Israel began their journey. So those two go together. Here's something else that's interesting. Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 9, you know what it says? Moses says, I told you that the burden of leadership was too great. You know, he says, that, how am I supposed to carry this people in their burdens? Guess what Numbers chapter 11 has? The burden of leadership is too heavy. So what we have to do then is we have to mesh Numbers chapter 11, Deuteronomy 1, verse 9. Does Deuteronomy tell a story about the spies? Yes, it does. Does the book of Numbers tell a story about the spies? Sure does. Numbers chapter 13. Here's what Ross wants to do. Let's look at Numbers 13 next to Deuteronomy chapter 1 and say, what do we know about the spy story here? What do we know about it here? Why would we not do that? We have to do that. It's horizontal reading. It's the only way that we have any chance of getting back to what is the book trying to tell us. You're in the right place. Be prepared to become informed as we continue our journey following the children of Israel. We're leaving Horeb, but the journey is just beginning. See you next week. Same time, same channel, Facebook, YouTube, Twitter. God bless you. Have a beautiful week. Shabbat Shalom, Shavua Tov.